Hi everyone, it's Jeff Allen, and I want to do a video. It's Thanksgiving week in the United States this week. I want to state that Thanksgiving in the United States, not Canada, right? Um, and I see a lot of posts on LinkedIn and Facebook about Thanksgiving, what it means, and all that. Lots of people's different interpretations of what it means. And I've really been thinking about this over the past maybe 10, 15 years. Given that I've spent the past 3 decades living overseas, not in the US, and and living in another culture where actually the meal that we have when I took my French wife to the United States in 1994, and she lived 4 years there, and she was so amazed at how fast people eat at Thanksgiving. And she's French, right? She was French, right? And she was always shocked by how fast the meal went. Because French people have longer meals in general, right? So I kind of joke that usually the Thanksgiving dinner that takes place in the United States, I had that every day in France, right? So, at least once a day. The duration of the meal. But I think some things I want to kind of relate to is some of the things I've been seeing on these LinkedIn posts and Facebook posts is about. I want to address a couple of things here. First thing is, a lot of people don't really know the origins of it very well. Now, there are different things. There's the harvest part of it, which comes from, the harvest festival of celebrating the harvest. So the English, the British do that. That's how they focus on this, right? That's what they focus on because they don't have the Thanksgiving holiday, right? So there's the whole harvest festival and usually, trying to get canned goods for the people that don't have food and all that. But the history of Thanksgiving, a lot of people don't really understand. I'll say that a lot of Americans are really bad at history, right? In fact, they're very poor in history classes. I took a number of history classes in the States, and during my junior high school, and college years, and a lot of people would sit there playing playing with their sports cards and stuff during history class. So a lot of people didn't really care about it. A lot of people don't, want to. They don't want to. I see my video series on understanding working Americans, where I talk about the rejection of the past, or at least focusing on the current, present, and really on the future, but really not investigating the past and not getting a lot of lessons learned from the past. And that's what I want to deal with here. And I recall growing up in Minneapolis as a young child, and I was probably 6 or 7. Yeah, because we moved when I was 8. So probably when I was about 6 years old, I got into Boy Scouts, right? And every year we'd have, the few years I was in Boy Scouts, we had the Thanksgiving celebration. We tell the whole story, and the Indians were thankful to the colonists. No, the colonists were thanks to the Indians for providing them food and stuff. And it was kind of a hard time. I mean, few people actually survived the trip across the sea, and those that did survive all the sicknesses and everything, then they got to a land where they didn't really know how to cultivate that land, and so that was pretty tough the first years. If you really do the history and study this pretty well, you can find out how hard it was. And then they were the population was wiped out. Another 50%. 50% of people died in the trip. 50%, another 50% of those didn't survive the first year. And then you tear it to new land, and then the Indians kind of saved them. I can't, this comes, and then it kind of depends. This is from one colony, right? I mean, all this comes from one colony in general. But this whole, I've now, and it's funny, I went to a high school that had an Indian I can't remember what we call this thing. I want to say logo. I don't remember we call this in English, right? The you know the thing for the high school, you know, the motto or the mascot, I guess, you know, is an Indian head with all the headdress and stuff. And that was more Hawaiian, but you know, this that got a lot of flack too. And the reason for all this is because, you know, after all the colonies and the move west, it it you know, the all the those colonists, you know, wiped out the Indians. And the Indians is their land, right? So this kind of thing. And then when I grew up in high school, went to go work on Indian reservations up in Canada a couple of summers, and I got to see the living conditions in those Indian reservations, which was kind of sad. Yeah, free peanut butter and free pasteurized cheese blocks. Wow, great stuff. And kind of that made me think a lot about things too. This is before I, you know, left to go leave overseas. And it's really made me think over the past, you know, this past decade or past 15 years about what is, you know, how much we were sold, how much we were sold this idea of Thanksgiving being a thankful thing, and in that we wiped out all the Indians, you know, did a significant massacres of the Indian population. And now I can understand why Indians don't want to celebrate Thanksgiving. You know, they don't want to do it. They don't want to celebrate a national holiday, and I totally understand that now. After living away from it for a while, but we try to cover over this sins of the past by having this Thanksgiving holiday thing, right? To thank the Indians. So I think there's a bit of that involved, which I think is an important thing to consider. And that all comes in, you know, there's a whole thing movement now of all the monuments in the South where you want to get rid of them and stuff. I mean, there's a lot of that, and I think we can't erase history. I mean, my master's degree was specifically, my thesis was specifically recounting the history of the French West Indies, of the cultures there and the languages there, and so that was the whole thing. The slave industry, there was a whole slave trade, right? So there was a bit of that. Quite a bit of that kind of dominated, and that created the languages that are there. And and so I think a lot about history, and have been a history buff, and really looking at socio-historical aspects of things. I do continue to think about this a lot. But I think that's one factor. Okay. Then I think another factor that I see is this. I see somebody post about, let's take this day to think about family and think about the important things in life. And I say to myself, why do we have to do this one day of a year? Why do Americans have to kill themselves all year long just to get to one day of a year, 1 week of the year, where they talk about focusing on family? I mean, I see these posts and they're contradictory, because it seems like the people are too busy to focus on their family all year long, right? And I think that's, I mean, living in France, and I'm not saying I've ever been the best husband, definitely have not been, and I've not been the best dad. But I've learned a lot about, the French culture's taught me a lot about family, how important family is all year long. And how it's important, and it did build in me a thing to make sure that I provided for my family all year long, for many years, and I did everything to make sure that the family, that I did not make the family move. I sacrificed my time to take trains every day for 4 hours a day, to make sure the family didn't have to move around. I didn't want to make that disruptive for the family. And I made personal choices to move my wife back to Europe, where I left, a career that I left an opportunity. I left a job that was, you just don't refuse that kind of job. And to get the job was just, and they called me, and then to leave it for personal reasons, for family reasons, to bring my wife back to her family and stuff. And that's a thing that most people won't do, right? You just make sure that you make it work elsewhere, another way. but I've made a lot of decisions in my life to make sure that, and not always the easiest decision, not always the best decisions, but made sure that the family was, try to make the family first. And I've made things that the family were not first. So, but this whole focus on Thanksgiving, of being the week, the day where you think about family, and then Christmas, the day that you think about family, you're missing 360 other days of the year. And the whole thing of, I talk a lot about the ethics, or I talk a lot about in my understanding working with America. Talk about in that book about a lot of my video book about a lot of different aspects of American culture that have formatted the people to be who they are, and it's very different than anywhere else in the world, so many other cultures and countries. But the Thanksgiving thing, that's making this video here, is to explain to not just Americans but to other cultures. It's really for other people, and I'll put it in my understanding and work with Americans playlist. What Thanksgiving means, and some, I think, what are some misinterpretations of it. And again, I'm making a general statement based on watching a lot of posts, and I'm not doing a survey of 300 million people, which with a lot of empirical data. I'm just basing on living 30 years abroad and having had over the past, since 2008 or 9, 2005, LinkedIn started, right? So every year you always get this since 2005, and then Facebook started about 2009-ish. So I got to count then. So it's all the social media kind of kicked in about that time. So I've been watching the social media every year, for the past 15-ish years or more, and watching how Thanksgiving is promoted and what it represents to a lot of different people. I got 10,000, contacts. It's not in connections on LinkedIn, and a couple thousand Facebook, and several thousand each with my Twitter channels or handles. So it's not like I kind of watch it and just kind of see what the general vibe is, right? And so many of the things are iterative. Again, this is a sample, and it's a sample of 300 million people. But it's interesting that the sample that comes out in the social media, which doesn't always represent everything underneath, right? And I'm not saying not everything that I see, but I'm seeing the majority of what I see. Focus side, but I could shout out to a few people who have made some really, interesting posts about Thanksgiving, not trying to just, saying it was a time to make a good meal, and don't try to get into the rest of it, right? And then there are some that are, social injustice warriors, and I'm not giving that a bad term. I'm not trying to denigrate that, but there are a lot of people that are very vocal, and I watch those too. But there aren't very many of those in Thanksgiving. Really, in fact, I haven't seen any about that. Thanksgiving, I've seen pretty much all the other stuff of the promoting Thanksgiving, right? Of what I just said, and that's why I made this video, because I think this video is going to kind of stand out as being different. And I'm not trying to be negative. I'm trying to just be realistic. I'm trying to just state an opinion. I've actually been, living away from it for so long, and getting a turkey here in France is kind of really impossible. So, and I've actually seen, French people sometimes trying to celebrate Thanksgiving, like 2 weeks ahead, and And they all, and a lot of churches kind of focus on this, trying to kind of tweak the meaning of it to go with Thanksgiving, and trying to make it go with a lot of the feasts of the Old Testament, which is kind of a parallel analogy, but that's not what Thanksgiving is, right? Thanksgiving is its own thing. It has its own historical moment, and it has a moment in history, and it's not about the feasts of the Old Testament, folks. Those feasts were the feasts in Jewish history. They're not the same at all. And I think that we need to be careful making all these parallels and try to make it use and avoid a lot of anachronism, thinking that things were always in the past as they are today, and trying to make all these parallels and analogies that try to make them adapt and try to appropriate them for something current and a completely different situation. I don't think that helps things. I think it distorts history and what history is about this. And I think that we need to keep in mind that Europeans did invade the majority of the world. They colonized it. I mean, think about the Roman Empire. Think about the Crusades. Think about, the different wars that happened that across many, many centuries. Think about the colonization of Africa and the West Indies and other places, and all of South America, actually all of the North and South Americas. And I think that and then think about today, where there's the kind of the military enterprise, policing the world. I think that all these kind of come into play over history. And I think that Thanksgiving is just kind of one moment in time of one day in history that has been distorted and has been reinterpreted many times. But I think that as we look over history, there's a lot of other things that we need to learn from and be aware of, and try not to repeat. And I think if what I would say here is, I would like to use Thanksgiving as a way to not recycle and reproduce history of those contexts that led to a lot of people losing their lands and losing their lives as a result afterwards. And it's kind of a sad thing, but it's kind of a reminder, and to have reconciliation of different groups, rather than just promoting the ongoing Europeans. I think that's what I want to say. So I think that's enough for that. But it's taken a lot of time. I'm kind of just being very clear about my opinion. I'm not right about everything. I don't think I think there are a lot of things I could be. I've got my point of view, and that comes from a lot of my history of my childhood and all that, and the choice I made in life to move where I moved to. But I think about and my family and all that. My family that I grew up in, and then the family that I created afterwards. I created with children and spouse and all that. But I think that these are all relevant individual interpretations of this, and I think this all kind of comes into play. But as a collective unit, as a nation, I think that we need to wake up to the negative things about Thanksgiving and what that did to our culture, to the Indian culture, to all those Indian tribes. And I think that's kind of really sad. And I think that we need to recognize that and not kind of just forget about it and wash over it, and it's no big deal. Because it's easy to forget history, and it can come back to haunt you and bite you in the butt, right? So I think that there's a lot of risk of that. So that's my thoughts for today on at least this topic of Thanksgiving. Thanks so much.